Friends, let me thank you once again for joining us for this, our final session of the truncated Take Five season. This season has been devoted to issues of friendship, and if you were able to join us a week and a half ago for John Knowles's a separate piece, we had a great discussion, and I think it's a testament to the novel's sophistication that during our discussion we could never really come to a consensus on the nature of Phineas's and Jean's friendship, whether it was a good friendship or if this was an issue of alpha males and beta males and it was more toxic. But however you look at it, we're going to see a different aspect of friendship here in Marian Wright Edelman's Lanterns, a Memoir of Mentors, and it's going to be presented for you by Verby Prevost. I just want to make a reminder that on the 30th, we will have a live Zoom session discussion of this book. So after you watch Verby's presentation, come with plenty of thoughts, notes, questions to our discussion on the 30th. That'll be at 6 p.m. Verby will be sending out a reminder and a link to it so that all you need to do is click on it, and there you'll be with the panelists and the other participants who are interested in discussing the memoir. I just also want to say again, thank you for tuning in this crazy season. We only had 3 sessions when you count the one in the fall semester, but we hope beyond hope that we will be back with a full 5-session season next academic year. God willing, the pandemic will be in the past, or at least enough in the past that we can all meet live. I really miss those sessions as much as I've enjoyed this and as much as I appreciate Verby and the other panelists participating. Boy, how nice it will be to actually see people face to face. We're all old friends here, and there's nothing like friendship to get us through these weird times. So I hope you're doing well. Let me turn the time over to Verby, just with the promise of more to come in months. Look for emails from me about what Take 5 has in session for the next academic year. Thanks once again, friends.
Thank you, Aaron. I know Take Fivers are grateful to you for ensuring that we could continue the series this year. And good evening, Take Fivers. We appreciate your continued faithful support, and we also welcome any newcomers and look forward to having all of you join us as the season returns live in 2022. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, a brief background. Our spring 2020 Take 5 series was cut short by the COVID-19 pandemic. So we debated about planning a 2021 series based on all the unknowns we were facing. After much deliberation under Aaron Shaheen's guidance, we decided, as most of you know, to plan a series based on the theme of friendship and to offer a session online via YouTube and Zoom in fall 2020 to serve as a trial run for the spring 2021 series. Katie Ryansky chose the book Crossings to Safety by Wallace Stegner, a wonderful novel that focused on the friendship of 2 couples. Based on the positive reaction to that fall online session, we then decided to do an abbreviated spring Take 5 online again with 2 sessions. For the first session, Hugh Prevost chose the novel A Separate Peace, a story of the friendship of 2 young men. I debated long and hard about my choice for the second session, but eventually I chose a nonfiction work, a memoir by Marian Wright Edelman entitled Lanterns, a Memoir of Mentors. I hope you've had a chance to read it. If not, I hope this presentation will encourage you to do so. It is quite a different choice from the 2 previous books, but several events occurred that led me to choose the book. And I want to share a little about those events as background to my discussion of Lanterns. In October 2019, I had my last visit with one of my major mentors, Ovid Vickers, a longtime teacher at East Central Community College in Mississippi. He died in April 2020, shortly before his 90th birthday. About the time of his death, I had just discovered and was reading Edelman's book. Through the years, Ovid Vickers had become, as mentors often do, a good friend. When I received the news of Ovid's death, the past came flooding back, and with it came such a strong connection between Edelman's book and my memories of Ovid Vickers. I grew up in rural Mississippi before the days of school consolidation and school integration. I attended a tiny, all-white school where I graduated in a class of 11. My experiences with the world outside my school and church were extremely limited, except through my wide reading. And my contacts with African Americans almost non-existent. Thus, I was devoid of any real knowledge of Black life, culture, and experiences. Information about Black issues was limited to mostly overheard conversations of my parents and even more rarely of other adults. I remember their expressed fear following the Brown versus Board of Education ruling in 1954. And doors to our home were locked for the first time, although I couldn't understand what was suddenly so frightening. I also remember a discussion in our small church about how to handle the situation if any Black persons showed up on a Sunday. A discussion I didn't understand then and still don't, since we were sending missionaries to Africa, but it was clear we wanted no contact with Black persons in our church. So when I, a naive but outspoken 17-year-old freshman in 1960-61 at East Central Community College, was put in a speech class with Ovid Vickers, I suddenly found myself, along with the class members, facing constant prodding questions. It became obvious one day that I was not prepared for some of these questions. He asked us, he was constantly talking about current events, and he asked us whether we thought schools should be segregated or integrated. Keep in mind, this was 6 years after Brown versus the Board of Education, but obviously no real changes had occurred in Mississippi. I immediately popped up with a standard supporting statement I had heard so frequently. Yes, separate but equal. Why? He asked. I mumbled something about that being better for both races. Why? He asked. I began to get flustered and muttered some other phrases that I no longer remember. But for everything I said, Ovid would simply ask once again, why? Amidst my growing frustration and uncertainty, a light bulb suddenly popped. I blurted out without thinking, because that's what my parents believe. Ovid looked at me and said, ah, and moved on. But I didn't move on. I started thinking about a lot of beliefs I had and why I had them. It was only much later that I realized how effectively Ovid had mastered Socratic teaching. He never told us what to think, but he did everything he could to push us to think critically about everything. And what a difference in my life it made over the course of the 2 years as he became my mentor both in and out of class. I was a changed person after that experience I just described. Not immediately and fully, of course. That took time. But it was the beginning of 2 years that had such a profound effect on me as I started for the first time to really think about race, about equality, about justice. Reading Edelman's memoir took me back to that time, back to the early 60s. I won't burden you with all the struggles and pains of my growth during that time, but Edelman brought it back to me. and made me think once again about being a white girl in Mississippi at that time. Academically confident, but extremely poor, and socially naive that I often felt out of place, even at a small community college, and later at the four-year college I graduated from. It took me quite a while to realize how privileged I was. One, because my parents both had a college education and had seen to it that I would have the opportunity to get one. And two, because I was white. Miriam Wright Edelman actually was significantly better off financially than I was growing up, and was clearly more knowledgeable about the real world, about social injustice, about racial injustice and social issues. 4 years older than me, Edelman, as a student at Spelman, had already been involved in trying to integrate restaurants in Atlanta, studied abroad, and gone off to law school by the time I was starting my freshman year, thinking, as a privileged white student, that segregation was not a problem. She was working in segregated Mississippi for voting rights for blacks and other issues of injustice by the time I graduated from college. I was not aware of her at that time, but I was keenly aware of and had become horrified by many of the things going on in Mississippi during that time. I had definitely begun to see things quite differently, but I managed, as did most of my friends, to shut myself away from dealing with the conflicts of the day by focusing on my studies during the school year and by having a wildly unexpected opportunity to spend my last two college summers working as a counselor in a Jewish camp in upstate New York, another wonderful growth experience for me. When we started talking about books for an abbreviated Spring 2021 series on friendship, Edelman's book immediately came to my mind. But I was initially inclined to dismiss it because novels generally seem to be more appealing to a wider audience. So I began thinking about other possibilities, including, as I mentioned in our last panel discussion, Toni Morrison's Sula, a story of the friendship of two females from childhood through adulthood that would seem to be an excellent parallel to A Separate Peace, which was our first book this spring. But the more I thought about it, the more I liked the concept of friendship in the broader direction that Lanterns seemed to offer. It's a true story of many friendships over a lifetime. But there was also another important reason to choose this book: its relevance to our current times. While the civil rights movement of the 60s brought many important changes, which form a significant part of Edelman's book, the move toward equal opportunity and equal justice for all is still far from being fully accomplished in this country. 2020 brought the horrific COVID pandemic, but it also brought to the forefront the continued problems of racial injustice, the dominant example being the death of George Floyd. It led to marches, speeches, protests that were highly reminiscent of the civil rights movement and the continued efforts that Edelman has been involved in ever since to help move the United States toward its goal of becoming a more perfect union. You may be surprised to learn, but probably won't be if you've read the book, that this summer at 81 years of age, and at times still the president of Children's Defense Fund, Marian Wright Edelman took to the streets, joining millions of people around the country in protesting police brutality after the killing of George Floyd. Edelman said the protest thrust her back to the 1950s and 1960s, when she was a teenager in the segregated South, hoping to make a difference in the world. She says, "I was out there every night. It felt like the sit-in movement to me. It felt like everything I've been living all my life." You see yourself again at 17, 18, and 19. It was one of her last protests as the head of CDC, the organization she founded in 1973. In September, she handed the reins over to the Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson, an activist known for his work in the aftermath of the fatal shooting of Michael Brown, a Black teenager, by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. Edelman will remain as President Emerita, but will not be involved in day-to-day operations. I certainly wouldn't be one to predict, however, that she'll never be in another protest. Before we delve into lanterns, I want to explore very briefly a little more basic biographical information about Marian Wright Edelman. Born in South Carolina, Marian Wright, who later married Peter Edelman and took his family name, attended Spelman, where she excelled academically, won scholarships for study abroad, and became involved in the civil rights movement in her senior year. She was arrested with a large group of students when she participated in sit-ins in segregated Atlanta restaurants. After graduating from Spelman, she earned a Juris Doctorate from Yale Law School and moved to Mississippi, where she became the first African-American woman admitted to the Mississippi bar, one of many firsts in her life. Edelman began practicing law with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Funds Mississippi office, working on racial justice issues connected with the civil rights movement. She also became nationally recognized as an advocate for Head Start. In 1968, Edelman moved to Washington, D.C., and she subsequently became counsel to the Poor People's Campaign that was organized by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. She founded the Washington Research Project, where she focused on lobbying Congress for child and family nutrition programs and expanding the Head Start program. In 1973, the Washington Research Project became the Children's Defense Fund, the United States' leading advocacy group for children, especially poor children, children of color, and children with disabilities. And she remained president, as I've already noted, until just a few months ago. In this memoir of mentors, of friends that we're examining, Edelman is primarily paying tribute to others rather than focusing on her many contributions to society. Still, through it, we get at least a glimpse of her accomplishments and most of all, an understanding of how any single person's contributions always involves many people who have served as mentors. Her willingness to acknowledge and her desire to pay tribute to all of these make her an even more admirable character in my mind. They also give witness to the fact that most accomplishments of significance take the joint efforts of many, not just a single person. In looking at the numerous mentors that she pays tribute to, it's impossible to deal with all of them in this presentation. So I decided to pick out the characteristics of her mentors, friends, that Edelman seemed to be the most influenced by. Foremost, the mentors she values were people who instilled in her a sense of belief in herself and a feeling that she could do and be anything she wished. They also instilled in her a sense of corresponding responsibility to do something for the greater good of all. Not surprisingly, her parents were at the beginning of this list. She seemed especially cognizant of the equal belief in and expectations her parents had for their 2 daughters, as well as for their 3 sons. They introduced her and her siblings to great writers and artists, both through books and through live encounters with them. Among the great African-American artists Edelman heard growing up was the one she was named for, Marian Anderson. Perhaps her parents' greatest influence on her confidence came through their examples. She says, "My belief that I and others could do more than complain, wring hands, or give in to despair, that the wrongs rife in the world stems from my parents' examples." And she provides numerous examples, but I'll mention just a few. There are the numerous things her parents did to provide Black children with opportunities for safe places to play and grow up, when they were excluded from the so-called public parks and swimming pools, with the public clearly being limited at that time to white children. Edelman is repeatedly made aware of blacks being excluded, but I was particularly touched by one poignant incident from her childhood. She tells of the time she and her father witnessed a white ambulance driver arrive on the scene of a middle-of-the-night collision near their home, only to drive away, leaving behind seriously injured black migrant workers after he saw that the white truck driver with whom they had collided was unhurt. Edelman's father's awareness of such injustices and his attempt to call attention to them might well be summed up in the ironic cartoon that he, as a minister, kept posted on the bulletin board of the church vestibule. Edelman describes it thus. It was a group of affluent white people sitting at a table filled with food. All around them stood hordes of emaciated, hungry brown people gazing at them as they ate. The caption of the searing cartoon was, "Shall we say grace?" In her growing sense of her own value and of her equal responsibility to others, Edelman also notes the positive influence of community elders and friends and of teachers. But obviously not everyone in Edelman's life met her standard for a great mentor, nor was a positive influence. As she points those out also, she makes her mentors look even more outstanding by contrast. Though she has praise for some of the things that she learned from her teachers that she had growing up, she found them mostly wanting, especially in an important characteristic. She says, "I cannot recall a single black teacher in my hometown ever speaking up or organizing publicly to challenge the educational or racial status quo." Septima Clark, one of my role models, in whose courageous voice I describe later in this book, said the greatest disappointment in her life was the failure of her black teacher colleagues to support the NAACP and her in the successful effort to equalize black and white teacher pay in South Carolina, a stand for which Clark got fired and from which they benefited. Edelman especially recalls one rather traumatic incident in her childhood that involved a teacher. Quote, "I remember as if it were yesterday how I felt when I went with one of my teachers and a church member into Belk's department store on Main Street when I was 6 or 7 years old. I was thirsty and went instinctively to drink from the nearby water fountain. I recall my teacher jerking me away in panic from the white water fountain, water trailing down my pinafore. It was the first time I remembered. It was the first thing I remembered when my sister told me that this teacher had died in her 90s. All her many kindnesses to me and my family never erased that moment that defined her as an adult, unable or unwilling to affirm my personhood and a child's fragile self-image. Perhaps if she had exuded less fear or had stopped and gently explained to me that segregated water was a stupid symbol of a stupid, unjust system that had nothing to do with my intrinsic worth or hers, and that she was sorry she could not do anything about it just then, but that it was wrong, I might have felt differently about her then and remember her differently now. Instead, I took my tiny wounded soul home to recount my hurt to my parents and sought reassurance that I was indeed as good as white people and that it was an inferior system and not an inferior me that denied me, a thirsty small child, water. I had learned in Sunday school and church, whosoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. I believed it and wanted adults I cared about to do so also. Three people Edelman met while she was at Spelman College stand out as major mentors for her. And it's a fascinating threesome. First was Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays, son of slaves, who earned a PhD from the University of Chicago and became president of Morehouse College. He was, as Edelman noted, the one of the 6 college presidents in the Atlanta University we looked up to most. He inspired and taught and stood by us when we challenged Atlanta's racial discrimination. She recalls the support that Dr. Mays gave Martin Luther King Jr. throughout his work and remembers standing with the thousands at MLK's farewell service, where Mays saluted his former student, fellow freedom fighter, and servant of God with Ralph Waldo Emerson's words. See how the masses of men worry themselves into nameless graves, while here and there a great, unselfish soul forgets himself into immortality. The second mentor at Spelman was Howard Zinn, a son of Jewish immigrants, who encouraged students to think outside the box and to question rather than accept conventional wisdom. He was a risk taker, Edelman says. I am indebted to him for my first interracial experience with the discussion group at the YMCA on international relations, and for going with his Black Spelman students to sit in the white section of the state legislature, which stopped its deliberations to hoot and jeer and demand that we be removed. He lost no opportunity to challenge segregation in theaters, libraries, restaurants, and encouraged us to do the same. He lived simply and non-materialistically. I felt comfortable asking to drive his old Chevrolet to transport picketers to Rich's department store. He was passionate about justice and his belief in the ability of individuals to make a difference in the world. He said what he believed, and he encouraged us as students to do the same. He conveyed to me and to other students that he believed in us. He was there when 200 students conducted sit-ins and 77 of us got arrested. He provided us a safe place in his home to plan civil rights activities by listening and not dictating. He laughed and enjoyed life, and he spoke up for the weak and little people against the big and powerful people. An eloquent chronicler in the people's history of the United States, of the civil rights movement, Zinn's most profound message in the title of one of his books is that, quote, you can't be neutral on a moving train. You can and must act against injustice. Edelman notes how Howard Zinn disturbed the Black Spelman establishment. In fact, he was eventually fired. And later, the white Boston University establishment, who disliked him as much as the Black Spelman establishment. Edelman says, he taught me to question and ponder what I read and heard, and to examine and apply the lessons of history in the context of daily political, social, and moral challenges like racial discrimination and income equality. She adds, he taught us to be neither victims nor passive observers of unjust treatment, but active and proud claimants of our American birthright. And Howard Zinn was the one who nominated Edelman to be a Merrill Scholar, providing her a scholarship that allowed her to study abroad and also introduced her to Charles Merrill Jr., who became her third important mentor while she was a student at Spelman, as well as years afterward. Charles Merrill Jr. was, of course, the son of wealthy white elites. I told you this was an interesting threesome. Merrill did not, as Edelman puts it, just give a scholarship. He gave himself in long conversations, letters, and visits. He became a lifelong friend whose confidence and expectations I wanted to live up to and reciprocate. Edelman notes that, quote, many ask today whether Black children and youth can benefit from white role models and mentors. Her response, of course they can. While children certainly need mentors with whom they can identify personally from common experiences of race, gender, culture, and economic circumstance, they also need to be shown and taught that human values and caring know no racial or gender boundaries, that all people have something to teach and learn, that race and class need not prevent sharing and helping, and that every person is our neighbor and every child our responsibility. Edelman briefly mentioned several other people who were important to her at Spelman, but she ends the Spelman chapter with a resounding tribute to these three aforementioned mentors. Like my daddy, she says, they reinforced in me a sense that I could transcend the world I lived in and help transform it into the world I wanted to see. They taught the oneness of humankind and shared a passion for justice and excellence. They empowered me to make a difference. I thank them and hope to pass their torch to those coming behind. Another gift that these mentors gave her was the opportunity to see a bigger, wider world, metaphorically and literally. Howard Zinn and Charles E. Merrill Jr., quote, gave me a chance to get outside myself, outside segregated America, and roam around inside myself, where one dreams, prays, and connects with our Creator and others. I learned I could travel the world without losing my moral compass and common sense. I learned not to fear, indeed to enjoy being alone. I learned to be comfortable in strange lands with people who speak different languages, worship God in many different ways, have different political systems and ideologies, and yet have the same human longing for freedom. With her mentoring, it's no surprise that Edelman, as a senior at Spelman, was a leader in a march to the state capitol in Atlanta. After the lunch counter sit-ins and some progress as a number of stores opened their counters to blacks, the Ku Klux Klan threatened to block any subsequent protests by black students. Edelman was one of the student leaders who planned and organized such a march, one from the library at Atlanta University to the state capitol. The presidents and most of the faculty of the black colleges were fearful and discouraged student participation in the event. I should note that her aforementioned mentor, Dr. Mays, was an exception. But about 1,000 students marched peacefully, singing all the way, while Atlanta police officers kept the KKK at bay with ropes and barricades. Edelman says, from that day, I learned that risk and failure have few friends and victory many, and that one should struggle to follow one's conscience, whatever the consequences. I also remembered that one should not wait for others, especially those in power, to say it's all right to act. When you know in your soul, after thinking through the pros and cons of doing something and doing nothing, that acting is right. My good friend Saul Alinsky once told me that the most immoral act of all is to do nothing in the face of injustice, a course so many choose most of their lives. Obviously, Edelman chose to do something about injustice and has spent and continues to spend her life fighting it. I will sum up her 4 years in Mississippi with a few brief quotations. She says, in my early Mississippi lawyering days, it was not an unusual experience to visit jailed civil rights clients and to find them beaten or abused or to hear bombs go off in Jackson. I never cranked up my car in the morning without leaving the driver's door open, having been instructed that if a bomb had been planted, you had a chance that way of being thrown from the car, injured rather than killed. The occasional random bullet I realized had whizzed by the wall I just passed was somehow reassuring and motivating rather than paralyzing. For me, a proof of a higher presence to which I could submit, come what may. In general, though, Edelman downplays her experience with danger and comments. I marveled at the courage of those who face violence and threats every day. As if yesterday, I see Hosea Williams, a Vietnam veteran on Dr. King's staff, climbing atop a car in Grenada, Mississippi, near nightfall, when civil rights demonstrations had been met by a feverish pitch of white violence and resistance. I looked out at the white police mob on one side of the street and the mob of white citizens on the other surrounding the black demonstrators. I chose to stand closer to the citizen mob. Hosea sang and made us sing away our fears. With this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. So courage was clearly another characteristic that Edelman repeatedly admired in her mentors and learned from them. Despite the obvious negatives of her experiences in Mississippi, Edelman maintains the biggest lessons I learned in Mississippi, which I wish everyone could get as forcefully as I did, were positive. They were about the strength and resiliency of the human spirit and the ability of determined people to resist and overcome evil through personal and collective will. Never have I felt the company of such a great cloud of witnesses for divine and human justice, willing to risk life and limb and shelter so that their children could be free and better educated. I thank God for Medgar Evers. Then she names other individuals and says, and a whole legion of others who put a bigger cause ahead of self. Clearly, Edelman learned from her mentors to live and teach a life of activism, a life devoted to helping others, especially children. This is reflected repeatedly both in her own actions and in her writings. In her 1987 book, Families in Peril, An Agenda for Social Change, Edelman describes the overall and comparative status of Black and white children and families in America, the unacceptable human and public costs that result from widespread child and family poverty, our nation's failure to invest adequately and preventatively in all our young, Black and white, poor and middle class alike. In another of her books, a children's book entitled I Can Make a Difference, a treasury to inspire our children, Edelman notes, the 20th century was characterized by stunning scientific and technological progress. We split the atom, pierced space, walked on the moon, landed on Mars, and broke the genetic code. Instant communication led to an information explosion and daily money trading in the millions. We witnessed astonishing increases in wealth resulting from a tiny microchip. We can fly through the air faster than the speed of sound and cruise the seas quicker than the creatures inhabiting them. We created the capacity to feed the world's population and to prevent the poverty that afflicts the majority of mankind. But something is missing. Our scientific and military progress has not been accompanied by comparable moral progress. While, as this previous statement notes, we still have a long way to go, Edelman feels grateful for the opportunity to have been part of some positive, significant changes in the 20th century. She notes in Lanterns, quote, it's not often that great leaders and great turning points in history converge and sweep us up in a movement. My generation was blessed beyond measure to be in the right places at the right times to experience and help bring transforming change to the South and to America, in partnership with mentor teachers like Dr. King, seeking to serve God and a bigger cause than ourselves. While Edelman pays tribute to dozens of well-known civil rights activists, I applaud her attempts to acknowledge the hundreds of others who spent years chipping away at the walls of segregation without the glare of outside media or much compensation. They are among the many unsung heroes, she says, unsung heroes and heroines who sowed seeds of racial justice that lead to gardens of righteous change all over our nation. As my conclusion, I'm using several quotations from Marian Wright Edelman from this book and elsewhere, which serve as a summation of her approach to life and her belief that we all have a responsibility to make a difference in the world. A lot of people are waiting for Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi to come back, but they're gone. We are it. It is up to us. It is up to you. We must not, in trying to think about how we can make a big difference, ignore the small daily differences we can make, which over time add up to big differences that we often cannot foresee. And this might be my favorite. You just need to be a flea against injustice. Enough committed fleas biting strategically can make even the biggest dog uncomfortable and transform even the biggest nation. And the final quotation is one that I think sums up her own life as she continues to live it. If you don't like the way the world is, you change it. You have an obligation to change it. You just do it, one step at a time. Marian Wright Edelman's memoir of her mentors seems to be a fitting conclusion for this short series on friendship. She has effectively detailed for us, with her many examples, what she thinks mentorship, friendship entails. Obviously, she believes it includes people of all races, ages, and economic status who bond together in goodwill to seek equal opportunity and equal justice for everyone. Her large circle of friends over the years is a testament to her own possession of these traits. Thank you, and I look forward to further discussion of this book with you via Zoom on March 30.